Cousin Anzelone, married to the family. Married to the family.
The following is a true account of Boy Meets Girl and her family. Madam Contest Master, dignitaries, fellow Toastmasters, and guests. So there we were. Everything was perfect, just the two of us in the restaurant, when the waitress hurried to our table and asked, "Excuse me, do you have New Jersey plates?" My then fiancée, without hesitation, lifted her empty plate above her head and said, "No, these are made in China." Now, I should have known by then that everyone who wanted to go to eat dinner at Steak and Alley and not Steak and Ale would be capable of these things. But what I didn't know then is that when you marry a Latin American girl, you don't just get the girl, you get the whole family. Now, I should have known early on that this was going to be a difficult thing for me, because after repeated attempts to even get a date with this girl, I never got any yeses from her. In fact, when I left messages at her house, I'm fairly certain those messages were never relayed to her. But finally, after months of persistence, she finally broke down and agreed to go out with me, and several of our mutual friends, of course. And that led to a second date, where then I got to meet the family. Well, her mother and father, they seemed pleasant enough. We shook hands and said hello. But when I shook hands with her brother, I felt every one of my knuckles under his protected brother death grip. But it must have gone okay, because from that point on, her family insisted on going with us everywhere we went. Now, I'm glad they accepted me, but when we went out to dinner, they insisted on going with us. We went to the movies. They went with us. And we went bowling, and they went too. I was again so happy, but I knew that if I did anything to separate me from her family, that might lead to a separation of me from her. So I continued dating her and her family. Then I hatched a wonderful plan. I thought, if I marry this girl, I'll have her all to myself. What a fool I was. What a fool I was. I remember sitting there in the living room with my father-in-law, my future father-in-law, asking for his daughter's hand in marriage. And between the few Heinekens that we shared and his lack of command of the English language, I'm not sure if he even knew what I was asking. He approved of my plan to marry his only daughter. But fortunately for both of us, our plans to wed were met with great acceptance and excitement. And so much so that all of her family from Ecuador wanted to see this wedding. They wanted to meet this gringo marrying into their family. And I thought, what a logistical nightmare this is going to be. How are we going to get all of her family here to Miami to meet us, to be at this wedding? What? We're going to Ecuador. The whole wedding's going to be in South America. Yes, it is. This was good to go. My first memory of Ecuador was how the Russian MiG train pilot dropped us down several thousand feet per second between the Andes Mountains to land in this tiny little runway in the city of Quito. And when we landed, the entire cabin erupted in great applause. Why? Why is everybody clapping? What happened? And my future wife said, "Well, we made it." What? We made it? Is this such a big deal? Well, apparently this is standard procedure on all flights going into Quito. At the airport, we were greeted by several dozen of her cousins, aunts, uncles, second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, housekeepers, pretty much anyone with a burning desire to meet this gringo marrying into her family. And after about an hour and a half of hugs and kisses and hellos and how are yous, we finally retired off to Tia Lilia's for a grand reception. And then with only about 4 hours of sleep, my father-in-law woke everybody up to take a grand tour of his country. First stop was to the car rental place, where we went and, what, no SUVs, you say? Okay, well, this brand new four-door Corsica is just perfect. We'll all fit in here, and it's not like we're going four-wheeling or anything. Later that night, My brother-in-law's knuckles, the same ones that crushed mine when we first met, were white and tightly clamped to the steering wheel as we slowly bumped down this steep hill in the middle of the jungle in a pouring, blinding rain in the middle of the jungle in Ecuador. And through the intercession of various saints, we made it to our destination in the dead of night along the Rio Negro, which is a tributary to the Amazon River. And I remember thinking to myself, this is not the car to be in. This is the worst possible car in which to traverse this treacherous Ecuadorian terrain. But my father-in-law insisted, no, this car is just perfect. It may be small, but it gets along just fine in these conditions. Okay. Well, after about another 5 hours of sleep, we woke up for our little journey along the Rio Negro, where I learned many interesting facts. Like these indigenous people, they used to be cannibals. The edge of the canoe, only 6 inches from the water that contained anaconda pythons, those giant pythons, as well as piranhas, and, by the way, malaria, poisonous insects, and snakes are all common in these parts. Good to know. Well, we made it safely back to our cabins that night, and we had another maybe 5 hours of sleep when the general, as my father-in-law was now being called for having gotten us up so early and keeping us on such a schedule, decided we were going to go to another village further up in the mountains and a little bit higher terrain. And I know it was higher terrain because I helped push the car when it ran out of gas. I thought to myself, this is totally inexcusable. How could we possibly be in the middle of nowhere and nobody was watching the gas gauge? Well, my future wife, her family thought this was a riot. They said, these are the things that make an adventure an adventure. And this, for me, was really a turning point in the family that I was marrying, and, of course, the girl. 16 years later, I know that I married the right family and girl. My wife is everything a perfect wife should be. But her family has become so much more. They've taught me, number one, that family is first. And second, they taught me that life is an adventure. So go out and explore a jungle. And finally, they taught me that when the car runs out of gas, you can either laugh or you can cry. Why not laugh? Madam Content.